Thanks. All right. Welcome back. Hope you all had a really good weekend, and we're getting really close here to the end of the term with just 3 full weeks left. So I'll do a little bit of housekeeping and updates about the remainder of the term. But the big thing I want to highlight is that your application of paper number ones are graded, and I've included for each of you a paragraph that's highlighting my feedback, comments, things that I felt that folks did really effectively, and things to continue to work on and to develop. I mentioned the possibility of a revision in your comments. So just as a reminder, you'll be able to pick either application paper 1 or 2 and do a significant revision of that one, which incorporates and utilizes the comments and feedback and just adds more materials. So think about the feedback on these as a chance to support you in developing both your next application paper, and also if you choose to revise your first application paper, more that you can draw from in that expanded version. So I'll talk more about the revision in the weeks ahead, but I did want to highlight that that is up. If you did a presentation or you had other outstanding material turned in, I should have your grades and feedback on that by the end of this week. So I enjoyed reading through the application papers. So I want to highlight some general things that I noticed, things that went well and things to work on. I thought in general, people really picked clear theories and overall pretty clear artifacts. For example, focusing on a specific television episode, focusing on perhaps a game or form of visual media. I thought people did a really good job of finding something concrete and showing a good understanding of the theory itself that they were using there. I thought people did a good job of incorporating those details, of using an introduction and conclusion to frame your analysis really effectively. And so I really appreciated that. The big thing that I would recommend working on sort of generally for the application paper 2 as well as the final revision is that while there was a good kind of analysis and incorporation of parts of the theory, make sure that you're getting into good and really rich detail about the artifact itself. For example, if you were citing from a film or television episode, it might be a really good idea to not only kind of generally discuss the plot, but to help your analysis and help focus your analysis, quoting lines of dialogue or quoting direct interactions between characters that are highlighting the concepts and ideas that you're getting out there, right? I think that just makes your analysis deeper and more meaningful and more connected. Another thing to think about here is the structure of the parts of the theory that you're using, right? So some people, for instance, chose the axioms of social penetration theory and used that for their analysis, which works. But do make sure that you're really identifying the parts of the theories really clearly that you're using and explaining and utilizing those examples. There are some kind of structural and convention things to continue to work on, such as using commas to separate out clauses of sentences. And for your full works cited for the textbook, make sure that you are using italics for a title of a book in most formats, as well as the hanging indent, where it is the second line that's indented rather than the first. So there were some structural grammatic things to focus on, but I think really focusing on deeper examples within the artifact itself is useful. Some people did a very general sweeping, or even looked at like multiple episodes or very big artifact, and focus on depth over breadth, right? Showing us specific examples and applications of the thing in action. But I thought across the board, folks generally did really well. You're welcome to reach out to me if you have any questions about my comments or the grade that you received in this assignment. But I enjoyed reading those, and I hope my feedback and comments is useful for you as you're preparing for your second application paper and your final revision of the course. Just to give you a glance of the remaining class meetings and what to expect. So this week, we are getting into 2 new theories. We're getting into cultivation theory and cultural studies. We also have a quiz due on Friday. On Sunday. Memorial Day, we'll have a long weekend, so we're not meeting that day. Instead, our only mandatory meeting next week is Wednesday, where we have muted group theory. And just like last time, your application paper, since it's due on June 4th, the Friday before, so Friday, June 2nd, is an attendance optional workday where you're welcome to come in if you need a space or you have questions for me. And then that application paper will be due then. And then in our last 3 meetings of the class, we'll go over the last 3 theories. There are a couple things that I want to highlight too. So talk a bit about the application paper 2 that just is this set of theories and should be a different artifact than what you chose last time. The extra credit opportunity is completely optional. But it is something you can have on your radar if you're on the bubble of a grade that you're interested in, or you just want some added security. So by June 15th, I'm asking you to pick a theory that we did not have the chance to get to in class. There's a lot of different theories here, and I tried to avoid ones that overlap too much with each other, but there are 3 that we weren't able to get into. So I'm asking you to pick one of those 3 theories that we didn't get to in class and explain and describe and assess that theory. And then the final paper is due on the 15th, right? And final paper, again, is where you are picking either your application paper 1 or 2, whichever you prefer, and revising it into a longer paper, 4 to 6 pages. It should include at least 3 outside sources, for example, outside sources that are using or describing the theory that you've selected, using the feedback given on the initial draft. And also, one thing that I'm asking you to include is a cover letter. And the idea of the cover letter is that you are explaining the changes that you've made from the initial version relative to the new version. For example, identifying what fixes you made from feedback, what things you added. That way you're really clear about the changes that you've made, right? And I actually have a template for the cover letter that you can consider too. So all that to say, application paper 2 is coming up. Then after that, you'll do that final research paper that picks one of those 2, expands on that, adds details, and all of that fun stuff. Any questions about anything related to the remainder of the term, class meetings, or anything else? Again, I enjoyed seeing those papers and appreciated your work in putting those together. So we took some time last class to start to brainstorm and develop some possible work for your second application paper due June 4th. I encourage you to continue to think about that and what you're interested in developing for this one. We also took some time to talk about communication accommodation theory, the idea of us modifying and adjusting the way that we speak to others to account for our interpersonal relationships. And there was also the idea here of blank, which is altering your communication behavior in a way that might be disrespectful or condescending to the other party. Anybody want to take a stab at what this is? Yeah. Yes, over accommodation, right? So over accommodation refers to, like I mentioned last class, bending over to your knees to talk to somebody in a wheelchair. For a lot of wheelchair users, that's seen as kind of disrespectful, right? Why wouldn't you just, bend your neck down rather than getting down and treating somebody as if they're a child? So that can be a challenge, is we're adjusting where we're communicating to meet the needs of other people, but we don't want to do so to such an extent that it is seen as disrespectful to that person. For today, we will be getting into relational dialectics theory, which gets at a lot of the tensions that we deal with in our interpersonal relationships. We'll have a class presentation in just a little bit from Nigma, and we'll be doing an activity and application of that issue. So again, I always love getting to talk about artifacts that I find fun. If you were to ask me today, like right at the moment, my top 3 favorite shows are, I would probably say in order, BoJack Horseman, Schitt's Creek, and The Good Place. So I love Schitt's Creek. It's a lot of fun. It's a very entertaining, feel-good show. And a good example here of the dynamics of a relationship at play that show us relational dialectics theory in action. So relational dialectics theory deals with the idea that the relationships that we have in our lives are a constant push-pull where we want 2 different things that are contradictory to each other. And we have to navigate those tensions in the relationships that we have with people. In other words, the relationships that we form with people in our lives are having to move between that spectrum of contradiction to figure out where in that spectrum we find ourselves. So as we'll be talking about, right, we both want to feel the security and attachment to other people, but we also want to feel freedom to do our own things. We want these 2 things that contradict, and we have to figure out how to navigate that tension in our own relationships. So this takes a socio-cultural orientation, right? It is in tradition looking at our human relationships. It is interpersonal, interpretive hermeneutic, and critical. in its method as well as its contexts. So it's looking at interpersonal relationships, trying to do so with an eye toward a more critical cultural perspective. And I'll be showing in a bit an example of a clip from Schitt's Creek. There's these two characters, David and Stevie, who are very good friends, right? Who for a period of time are involved, but are having to navigate some of the tensions of their relationship. What does their relationship mean? What does it mean to be kind of moving from a romantic relationship to a platonic friendship? And also understanding and engaging with challenges related to articulating and describing sexuality, sexual orientation. This theory comes from Leslie Baxter and Barbara Montgomery, two scholars, again, concerned with communication, the study of human communication, and how we navigate human communication in interpersonal and family relationships. So here's the idea that kind of gets at the core of relational dialectics, right? So again, the core of a relationship, if you think about the relationship as the Venn diagram between two people, what two people share, what two people connect over, what they have in common, and what that two-way communication looks like, is the idea, first of all, that there's a monologic engagement, there's agreement between two parties. So maybe both parties say, we are in, there's nothing serious, there's no strings attached in our relationship, and there's an agreement between the two people in how their approach to freedom looks, right? And again, this can be for platonic relationships, family relationships, romantic relationships, a variety of different interpersonal arrangements. Another way of thinking about relational contradictions is a dualistic way, in which the two parts of the contradiction are separate, right? So over here we have freedom, being able to be and act however you want. Over here we have security, being in the sort of setting or context that feels safe, but does not necessarily allow you the level of freedom. And the idea here of a dialectic, well, that goes back to the Greeks, right? If we think about the idea of dialectic as the counterpoint to rhetoric, dialectic refers to the idea of through dialogue, through tension, through debate. According to the ancient Greeks, the truth would be unveiled, that we learn more through the process of debate, of differing viewpoints and ideas that bounce off of each other and help us to learn more, right? So according to this theory, dialectic is playing off of these two contradictions. So what are these contradictions? Well, there's a variety of different ones that can be at play in our interpersonal relationships. There are three that were initially highlighted by the theory, although more have developed over time to understand and shape our interpersonal relationships. One of them deals with the idea, as mentioned, of autonomy on the one side versus connection on the other side. On the one end, we want to feel like we're our own people. We are operating independently, we make our own decisions, we have our own choices, we're financially independent, right? But at the same time, we want to feel connection and closeness to other people. But in the process of feeling connection, right, we are giving up some of our autonomy. We're choosing, instead of having a free time off in the afternoon, we're helping out, our sibling with studying for an exam, right? So that's this idea, again, that we have these two extremes. We want two things at the same time. We're trying to figure out how to negotiate these two things that we want. We want to be our own people, but we also want to connect to other people. Another key contradiction here is the idea of openness versus protection. Again, if we think about this as a spectrum, on the one end, we want to be open, we want to be honest, we want to give our heart out to other people, we want to share how we really feel and what we really think, right? We want to be honest and open about our identities. But, right, we know that in the process of being open, of sharing details about ourselves, that could be potentially hurtful, right? That people can share, use rumors, you could share who you are, and that can be rejected by somebody, right? So we also take steps to protect ourselves, to protect our identities, to be cautious about what we choose to share to other people. Another issue that happens, right, is the idea of novelty versus predictability. On the one end, we like things to be novel. We like things to be new, right? Oftentimes, right, there's a phrase that comes up like new relationship energy. You've started a relationship with somebody and there's like a spark, there's a lot of tension and excitement that comes in navigating that new space with that person. So we like things that feel new and unique. But we also are creatures of habit. We like the idea of things feeling predictable, of things feeling comfortable. and feeling like we have a pattern of what we can expect. Again, if we think about things like uncertainty reduction theory, that gets at our desire for predictability too. So how can something be both new and also steady and predictable? Another issue is public versus private, right? Public being what we choose to share and openly convey in a public setting, right? What shows up if there's a search for you on a social media profile, what publicly appears versus what information you choose to hide, unless there's somebody that is friends with you or what's considered to be a really close friend, right? And what information is private, kept to yourself or kept with people very close to you. Again, if we think about communication privacy management theory, that gets at some of these ideas too. Another relational contradiction here is the idea of ideal versus real. This happens a lot when we think about what we want, what the perfect world, what the perfect relationship looks like, where do we want to be, what do we want out of life, versus what is, what do we have to reconcile as being the truth and facts, right? So we have to also factor in those things. So all that to say, in our relationships, we want things that might not necessarily be compatible. And we have a variety of cognitive and communication strategies that we use to manage these types of contradictions. So there are 4 considered to be primary approaches that people use to address these dialectical tensions. One of them is the idea of cyclical alteration, right? So cyclical alteration deals with the idea that you are moving between these 2 different extremes or spaces, depending upon the situation or context that you're in. For example, perhaps you say, you know what, Tuesday is like my day. I don't schedule any social events. I have the freedom to do whatever the heck I want on Tuesdays. That's my day. But Thursdays, I do things for friends. I spend time with friends, right? Like, so we're altering between one extreme or the other. Segmenting, right, is also compartmentalizing. So maybe in this setting, like on Instagram, I'm very free, I'm very open, but on Facebook, I barely use it. I mostly use it for like Messenger, right? So sometimes you're making decisions about the relationships and situations in which you are one thing or the other. Selection deals with the idea that a way of managing tensions is just to make a decision about which of these extremes is the most important to you. For example, maybe you're somebody that's really strongly in the novelty camp. You like things to be new and exciting, so in your life, you're not necessarily interested in something serious or in a long-term relationship because novelty is what feels good to you, and you've chosen that as kind of the extreme that you want to incorporate. And then there's also this idea of integration, right? Where you find a way to incorporate some of these different elements together. For example, maybe you incorporate novelty and predictability where you're in a long-term relationship with somebody, but you and that person agree every week you're going to try to go somewhere new. Maybe you're traveling to a new place, you're trying a new restaurant, you're doing something that's fun or different as a way to continue to add novelty and excitement into your relationship, right? Also, this is not to say that everybody necessarily falls within one extreme or the other. This is a spectrum, right? So sometimes people are going to have some in-between place in a relationship where they have some degree of openness. They disclose and talk about some things together. They also don't share. They hide some other things too. Again, if we think about social penetration theory, right, the layers of the onion, maybe you share up into the middle layer and you're somewhere in between on the spectrum between openness and protection. So how we fall and how we choose to manage our relationships doesn't mean we're totally on one side or the other. It means that we're finding the space that works and makes sense for us in navigating that tension in our relationships. So, relational dialectics is dealing with these tensions and the way that we respond to these tensions. While this is a useful theory, it does have some critique. So one of the theories here is about parsimony, right? How much is this theory being utilized and integrated? While new contradictions have been developed and explored over time, the core 3 of autonomy, connection, novelty, predictability, and open and closedness were the ones that really started out this theory. So there might be a lot of other contradictions that we deal with in our lives that aren't being fully represented in some of these extremes that are articulated. It's also not an empirical theory, right? It can be difficult to apply, like a lot of more interpretive and qualitative theories. How do we measure openness, closeness? How do we consider the role of culture in defining some of these things too? Because culture might shape our approaches on some of these issues. And, can be complicated to define these spectrums and to define the approaches that people take to addressing those things. Again, it takes a very linear approach and doesn't necessarily consider some of the nuances of context. In what situations am I comfortable with being open? And in what contexts am I comfortable with protection? Sometimes I want different things at different times, or sometimes it plays out differently over the course of a conversation. So there's some nuances of how we navigate some of these tensions that aren't necessarily fully represented within the theory. But this is still a really useful theory when we find in our relationships that we're wanting things that don't always line up neatly. So it's a useful theory to understand some of the challenges we navigate in human relationships. So with that being said, we will have our class presentation from Nigma here. I got your slides and material all ready to go. So we will hear from you whenever you're set. You're welcome to click or use the arrow keys as you're working through slides. We'll give just a minute to get my timer going and whenever you're ready.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nigma Moses, and my presentation will be on relational dialectics, specifically in the article, The Role of Heritage Camps in Identity Development Among Korean Transitional Adoptees through a Relational Dialectics Approach. So the article is from Tracy H. Randolph and Melissa Holtzman. They were Korean adoptees into American families, and they had this feeling like they didn't know which side they should represent in terms of their heritage, because they feel like if they were being too Asian, it'd be to deny the love and nurture from their adoptive parents. But then if they were to just solely focus on just being American, that would be denying their ancestry. So then they wanted to find what was the right in between in juggling the desire for which race to embrace. And that's when the connection to relational dialectics happened. It's the framework that makes it similar. So they're both perspectives are contradictory, and it's that push and pull and tension. That's what makes it what it is. That's because the relationship is not static, but rather a dynamic one. So in this article, they wanted to interview other Korean adoptees, children, and their parents, American parents, and to find that in between. So that was the method they used. The participants were Caucasian American parents and their Korean-born children. And that is when the key ideas of relational dialectics, their contradictions, as Professor Mann explained in class, autonomy and connection is there, whether it's independence or their need for connection, their openness and protection. So do they want to be private? Do they want to be open? And there's novelty and predictability, or they want it to be predictable and stable, or things to be spontaneous. And these are the tensions that they felt particularly within. So then in the same time, the child feels like their real parents or their birth parents abandoned them, but in the same time, they're also feeling lucky because they were chosen to be adopted. And the same thing can happen with the parents' relationship, as they can also feel loss for the real parents as they had to let go of their child. But then in the same time, they're also feeling happy because they're able to welcome this child into their family and bring and raise them. And so from what I learned from the article specifically is that children that went through these heritage camps, they typically grew up to be more well-behaved and better adjusted in terms of like how they view themselves. And specifically from this theory is that although it's not specifically into relational dialectics in face value, but the framework can explain many different situations and relationships that people go through, whether it has tension that pulls or pull, basically, yeah. Sorry, where I got the article.
So thank you so much for sharing. I think this is a really great article that gets into, again, a lot of the nuances and components of this theory really effectively, right? So as you brought up here, you know, in examining some of these relational tensions, and the broader idea that our relationships are dealing with a variety of tensions that we have to navigate and how we represent ourselves and you know, share ourselves interpersonally. One thing to think about here is the experiences of individuals who are biracial, multiracial, and how they find their race, their ethnicity, their culture, their background represented or not, you know, kind of stuck between or navigating multiple experiences, or an adopted child for whom the race, ethnicity, cultural experience is different from their family and parents than you know, what they identify for themselves. So that can be a way in which some of these challenges in finding yourself represented identity-wise can be expanded upon, right? Again, these contradictions that are outlined by the theory don't get at the exhaustive number of contradictions we have to navigate in our interpersonal relationships. So this article does a great job of highlighting some of the unique challenges of how we disclose, navigate, and figure out our identity and the version of ourselves that we want to be. You know, another thing to think about with this theory is that sometimes, depending upon the person, where you fall in that spectrum of what you want, do you want freedom, security, openness, protection, those are going to look really different depending upon what you know about this person and the ways that you and that person might or might not connect. So excellent work, and I think a really good example here of how we can learn more about relational dialectics. So I want to share a clip from Schitt's Creek. This is actually you know, pretty well known with regard to its explanation of experiences with members of LGBT+ community, talking about identity, sharing identity, and sharing sort of through the use of a metaphor, the experiences of sexuality, right? So characters David on the right, Stevie on the left are, you know, have been involved, they've been together, but now they're just friends. And Stevie is kind of trying to figure out David's sexuality and sexual orientation. And there's a little bit of confusion on their end about, you know, where David falls on that. And so what he's doing in this conversation is kind of contextualizing, explaining through the use of metaphor, you know, where he falls and using sort of navigating that dialectical tension, particularly talking about openness, disclosure, establishing boundaries and disclosure of himself and where he falls. And it's interesting to note this kind of metaphor has been used in a lot of folks in LGBTQ communities to describe the experiences of sexuality, particularly for folks who may be pansexual, bisexual, somewhere under that umbrella where they don't firmly fall onto either side of the Kinsey scale. So just wanted to share some of the ideas of this theory in action in this way.
So to be clear, I'm a red wine drinker. They only drink. You too only drink.
This. I do drink red wine, but I also drink white wine. And I've been known to sample the occasional rosé. And a couple summers back, I tried a Merlot. It used to be a Chardonnay.
Oh,
It's quite a bit complicated.
yeah, so you're just really open to all wines.
I like the wine and not the label. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does. Once you then roll over and kind of start to sleep with regret, then we're good, right?
No, I absolutely did that. Just wept for hours in the dark. I say to go with
So kind of a fun example here, again, using the metaphor of like wine and type of wine to describe sexuality, sexual orientation. But, helping us to see relational dialectics, right? The two characters, there's connection, but they're kind of using metaphor as a means of creating some level of distance and trying to understand and engage with one another. Again, navigating dialectical tensions, how much you want to share, how much you want to disclose, what level of comfort do you have? That's something that we might use abstraction for to try to develop our relationships. Okay. So what I'm going to have us do is I'm going to split you into different groups. And I'm going to have each group focus on one of the 5 dialectical tensions. So what I'm going to ask you to do and have one person write or type to share in a bit is to explain what this dialectical tension is in the context of what we talked about together and in some work on your own too. How do you, as folks in groups, manage or deal with this dialectical tension as it plays out in some of your own relationships? And then lastly, what would be an example or scenario where people were having to navigate this tension? So I'll give time for people in groups to chat, to discuss, and then we'll take about 10 minutes or so and have people share to the class as a whole. So I'm going to number you from 1 to 5, starting here on this side. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3. So if you're a 1, front up here, 2, middle front, 3 over here, 4 back here, and then 5 back here. So take some time in your groups. 1s are autonomy connection, 2s are openness protection, 3s are novelty and predictability, 4s are public private, and 5s are ideal real. So take some time, introduce yourselves, and talk a little bit about these tensions and how you see these playing out. Yes, sir.
That's what it's just
It's like you have to find yourself versus do that. Yeah. Finding a balance. There's too many, like, you can end up relationships. I don't think that's sometimes you think that it's like you trying to sort of wrap it around do things with love. Also.
Like in that same vein. For so some who invite you up like, hey, they're social finance, so I would rather be allowed. Or. Yeah. Yeah.
It's not. A lot of the to like structure.
I guess.
Having structure is really important. When you get on something like you and you can remind them of it. I'm just gonna do.
There might be a world that.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get into this. Schoolwork and everything, you know. Yeah.
So take about 5 more minutes to continue discussing.
So another underwater passage. Yeah. It's so many, it's all character development. I watched maybe it takes a big turn on the. But that's how I thought it was. Wow. I was not expecting that. I did expect. Oh. That was just. I don't want to read it. I don't like it right now. I want to walk in and be another. Really? I don't even know. But it's. You knew you were gonna die. I want to watch members. I like $10. Style of the word that I do is just all complimentary. I love
So take a couple more minutes to finish and have somebody from each group ready to share. Which groups would like some more time? Sounds like folks are about ready to share. So why don't we take some time to go to each group, and I'd like each group to just address your answers. You know, what is this tension? How do you all discuss dealing with that tension? And how might you navigate that in an example or scenario? Start with autonomy and connection.
For number one, we said it was wanting to be your own person and rely on yourself versus wanting to feel connected to others and relying on others. For two, we did finding a balance between the two. Sometimes you need your personal space and to recharge your social battery and enjoy being alone, but also enjoy doing things with other people.
Yeah.
For three, we said telling someone that you don't want to go do something in order to recharge your social battery, but you'll talk to them about it tomorrow. Showing an example of autonomy, choosing to be your own person by staying in, and connection, wanting to still hear about it later.
Great. So there's a common phrase discussing introverts versus extroverts, right? Introverts recharge being alone, their social battery. Extroverts oftentimes recharge by being with other people. So what is considered to be appropriate and navigating your level of social comfort is something you can disclose and share in navigating that. Let's talk about openness versus protection.
Yeah, so we decided kind of like things you want to keep to yourself and kind of like things you want to share with the world, just like a private public relationship. And then for number two, we said it's like kind of like choosing like maybe like siblings or like your whole family to share personal information with versus like friends and teammates. And like it's sort of you could share like things that's like your daily life. And for number three, like as an example, we use like inside jokes for groups, like jokes would fly with this group, but you probably wouldn't want to say these sensitive things with others.
Great. So if we think about, like, for instance, code switching or disclosure, right? Sometimes it's not necessarily a linear, we share more with this person and less with this person, but we're strategic about the things that we share. Maybe you have a family member or close friend where you are totally different and disagree on some type of major view, like religious, political view, but you connect over a lot of other things. So you talk very deeply about other things that are outside of that topic. Or maybe you find that your ability to disclose and share information with that person is fairly limited. So where you find yourself on the spectrum, what we consider to be appropriate for the situation and the needs of the other person can be a way of complicating how this tension is defined. About novelty versus predictability.
So we defined it as sort of a contrast to the want of exploring new novel things as opposed to having knowledge of what's going to come in the relationship and staying with the same sorts of ideas. So one way of managing and dealing with this was to plan your experiences ahead of time to experience that sense of novelty with your already knowledge of predictability. We did a kind of specific example of, for example, if one partner wanted to try a new coffee place and one didn't, they could compromise and said, for example, in 1 week, they can plan ahead of time to go to one new coffee place, and then the next time they go back to their usual spot.
Yeah, so planning for something new is oftentimes a way of navigating the spontaneity of that new thing with the ability to feel like you're prepared going in, right? So if, for instance, you're visiting a new city, right? You're trying to think about, well, I want to go see this, this, and this. And sometimes, right, some types of planners are very like, they have a full itinerary of exactly what they're going to do. Other people are a lot more spontaneous. I just want to go downtown and see what happens, right? So how people fall in that spectrum can differ a lot. How about public versus private?
We said attention for this was, we based it off like an internal feeling of like for each situation and making sure you don't create tension and you become enough like information that's appropriate for each like situation to not create tension. And then to manage this was researching it and like for the context for each situation, if they're out for like topic and audience, you could like reduce the tension as much as possible so you can like appropriately share things. And then what we brought up was like when you're campaigning for something or like giving a like a speech on a certain topic for a certain group, making sure like you have enough information that's like representing the topic, but you're also keeping things higher than that group wants private.
Right. So sometimes, right, if you're put in a public setting, there's a bit of a spotlight put on you for private information and details that can come up, like a scandal, right? But also, right, one of the things to think about is the appropriateness of sharing the amount of private material too. So while we want to be careful about how much we choose to share, it's also true on the other end that there might be something seen as oversharing, as not appropriate to the situation, as off topic or off base from what you and the other person have agreed to share or talk about. So that can be a challenge too. It's not only thinking, what am I comfortable with sharing, but what is the other person comfortable hearing? And what are they expecting to hear from that relative to what's considered to be socially appropriate for that scenario? So that can be an issue related to disclosure too. And how about ideal versus real?
So we kind of looked at it as expectations versus reality.
Yeah.
What you want to have happen, like what is ideal, and then what's really happening is what's real.
Mhm.
Brandon for number 2 said that he just expects the worst, so anything else that happens is positive. Or just not having your, not expecting things to go too well for you, so you're not disappointed. And then for number 3, we kind of talked about having this like ideal relationship with the person before you even know them. And then you get to know them and you're like, oh, maybe it was all in my head and they're really not this great or something like that.
But yeah, low expectations can be a good strategy of navigating this, right? Because you avoid feeling too disappointed. Sometimes there's a critique, oh, you're being too optimistic, you've got your head in the clouds if you fall too much on the ideal spectrum. But on the flip side, if somebody is focused too hard on the real, that can be seen as maybe being a bit too dour, too pessimistic, not giving things a chance. So I think one thing that's really coming about from you all's discussions, right, is we think about dialectical tensions in a personal way. What do we want? What are we choosing to do? But our interpersonal communication is mutual, right? It's also about what is comfortable, what's appropriate to the other person. So while it's useful for us to think about what we can publicly and privately share, it's also useful for us to think about, what does the other person want shared, right? So, this tension and navigating this tension, it's a mutual process and it involves a lot of a careful, thoughtful communication with that person about what is and is not considered to be appropriate. By the way, this is another really good candidate for your second application paper, particularly if you wanted to look at an example, like I showed, like a mediated example of a relationship between characters in which they're navigating dialectical tensions. Maybe you choose to highlight some of those tensions and explain how those tensions play out in the relationship. So just again, another example of some of the ways that you might utilize this theory for your application paper. But really enjoyed your discussion, your insights here with regard to how we navigate those tensions day to day. So to wrap up for today, we talked about relational dialectics, how we deal with tensions, cognitive dissonance, we want two things that contradict each other, and how these tensions play out over the course of a lot of our relationships. On Wednesday, we have 2 presentations from Jack and Luke, and we will get into cultivation theory, focus more on the role of media and changing attitudes, beliefs, and values. So please email or pass forward your group's work with your group member names if you haven't done so already. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you again for class on Wednesday.